Okay, so now that you've got a good solid understanding of why we would do a VSM event, what are some of those reasons, now let's talk a little bit about what do we need to do before the actual event. Now there's a number of things we need to do to prepare for a value stream mapping session. One is to just simply identify and talk with the key stakeholders in the process that you're going to map. So you should have some sense of where are we starting, where are we finishing with this process map. Who are the key stakeholders in this process? The people actually doing the work in each of the steps of the process, the managers of the processes, the customer of the process, the supplier of the process, the people that are feeding data into these processes. So making sure we know who those people are and talking with those key stakeholders to identify maybe where some of the issues are, some of the challenges are, who some of the key players are, so that we can understand who needs to be invited to the session. So identifying and talking with stakeholders. And then identify the value stream to map. We definitely need to understand, where are we starting, where are we finishing. So this is what I tend to call these my bookmarks or my bookends. So who's the customer and who's the supplier, and all the pieces in between are going to be the people that we need in this session. So just by identifying the value stream that we're focusing on, what are we calling this value stream, and making sure that we're in sync with exactly what we're going to focus on during the session is also an important step to get prepared for the VSM event. And then the data collection plan. This is probably what will take the most time. So when we go into a VSM session, we're mapping out this process. We don't want to have to spend a lot of time going and digging for data to fill in the blanks while we're actually making the map. We want to come prepared with this information. So by knowing what value stream we're mapping, the starting point and the finishing point, we're going to have some sense of, okay, these are the process steps that we're likely going to be mapping, and we're going to want to collect some data for these different steps. So we're looking at a minimum cycle time. How long does it take to do each step? But other key metrics that we would be looking for are how many people are doing the process, what percentage of rework is taking place in the process, what percent of the time does product or service flow through that step in the process perfectly. If it's a mechanical process, we're shifting or changing over from one product to another. How long does it take us to switch from one product type to another product type? So there's a myriad of data that we can collect, but at a minimum we want to know the process cycle time. And so building this data collection plan is a crucial element to having a really streamlined and well-facilitated session, because you don't want to be fumbling around looking for data during the session and wasting people's time. So laying out your data collection plan is also key to getting prepared for the session. And then going and talking with customers and suppliers, trying to understand from the customer's perspective, what's going well, what could use improvement. Also understanding what is their demand, or the tact time that we call it in the lean lingo. What is their demand? Do they want 1 a day, 10 a day, 40 a day? And so having a clear sense of what the customer's demand is, and identifying some of the issues maybe that they might be having with the process. And then suppliers, understanding from the supplier's perspective, what are they feeding into the process, at what rate are they feeding it in, and in what quantities or what batches might be they feed the information or the material into the process. So talking with customers and suppliers. And then materials inventory, having a good sense of the materials that we're going to need for the event. So this might be post-it notes, this might be all the supplies you're going to need during the session itself, but it can also be looking at the inventory currently in the process itself as well. So materials here, I'm really focused on the physical materials we're going to need for the session itself, not necessarily materials in the value stream map. So having that inventory is also part of getting ready for the session. And then the agenda. You want to make sure that you know exactly what you're going to be doing every minute of this session. So typically when I create my agendas, I just lay out how are we going to work through this process of creating our value stream map, about how much time are we going to need for each of these steps in the process, and factoring in breaks and lunches is also going to tell you how much time you're typically going to need. Now it really depends on how detailed you get into the value stream map and how big of a value stream you're mapping as to how long it's going to take. But on average, it takes about a day to 2 days typically to do a really robust value stream. And the last thing you want to do is get halfway through it and have to pull this group back together later. So I always err on the side of having too much time where people are going to discuss and debate and maybe argue a little bit. They're not just going to come together and map this thing out and be done with it. There's always going to be some discussions. And so typically at a minimum, it's about a day to go through this process of mapping if you're really well prepared. So just lay your agenda out, put times to each of the action steps of creating the value stream map, and see how it lays out. You know, it's typically going to be a day to 2 days to do a session. So these are all things to think about as you get ready for the event. A few other things that I haven't noted here are identifying who your champion is for this event as well is also critical. So identifying who owns this process you're mapping out. If you've got multiple owners of the process, multiple leaders, you may have a little bit of a challenge there. Typically, I like to try to stick with one champion or one process owner that owns all the steps within the process. So identifying who that person is and talking with them is also a critical thing to do before the event as well. Identifying what their goals and their objectives are for the session, what they want to see as the outcome of the session is also something to be thinking about. So just a few things to think about during getting ready for the VSM session. And next we'll talk about how to execute the session.